Hello everyone, and welcome to our Waterline Pro tutorial for lake actors. Now, lake actors is something that we introduced in Waterline Pro Update 5.0. And here we're going to look into what they are, how they work, what their sort of purpose is, and how we can customize materials for them to make them look this good. So without further ado, let's just delete this big boy over here. And let's have a look at our sort of setup that we've used. Now, we have a bunch of other lake actors here as well that we're just going to hide for the moment. We'll go over these towards the end of the video. In terms of terrain, what we've done is actually we're using a couple of Megascans actors. So this gigantic sandstone terrain and this gigantic sandstone terrain. This one we've kind of modified a little bit to make it into to turn it into a crater, and we're just going to go over these towards the end of the video. They've been all just kind of placed around. Now, if you're an Unreal Engine 4 and Unreal Engine 5 user, which you probably are if you're looking at this, Quixel Megascans is free for use, so you could recreate the scene at no additional cost, really. So let's crack on with the rest of our setup. Next up, we have a directional light. We haven't really changed too much with it, just lowered the intensity to 8. And we've also added in contact shadows. These are pretty much screen space shadows, and they're very useful for adding long range shadows like in this landscape. Now, if you've got a nicer machine than us, which is not too difficult at the moment, you might be using virtual shadow maps or ray trace shadows. So you probably won't be needing this, but for the rest of us, this is a really nice way of getting a little bit of an extra detail over really large landscape scenes like that. Next up, we're going to go to our sky atmosphere. Now, our sky atmosphere, we've just set it to movable, and everything is vanilla. This little reset to basics is just here no matter what you do. So we haven't really done anything special with our sky atmosphere. In terms of our skylight, it's again nothing too special. We've just set it to movable and real-time capture. And that's it. So this isn't really a mind-breaking setup or anything. This is pretty much a standard way that we start building our scenes over here. In terms of post-process volume, we've changed a couple of things now. The first of all is because we're going for a bit of more of a cinematic look, we've changed our blue method to use the convolution blur over the standard. Now, if you go standard, things get a very bloomy and sort of bright and washed out. Now, this might be the kind of look that you like, but right now we're looking for this kind of thing, a bit more sharper image. Now, be warned, if you're using this as for a game or real-time or interactive project, this is a very expensive effect for what it is, but it also can make the scene look extra bit of nice and realistic. Next up, one more thing that we've changed is our lumen screen distance and max trace distance. We're going to be showing off what these two values do towards the end of the video as well. But for now, this is our kind of setup that we have. So let's crack on. So starting off, we could go to our content browser, and this is basically our Waterline folder. This is just our tutorial where this map currently resides. So let's go into our lake folder, and let's grab our lake actor. Now, a good question is, what are lake actors? Lake actors at the moment are our bridge between WaterSim Infinite actors, which are pretty much this water simulation solution, but if we dropped one, it will stretch all the way to the horizon. And in this case, it will fill up every single nook and cranny of our nice landscape, and we don't want that. In this particular instance, we want to have multiple lakes at multiple levels with multiple settings. And our infinite actor was just not able to do that. It works very well for a very large sea or a very large lake, but again, it acts as a global water level. It's a bit cheaper to render, but yeah, if you want to have the sort of creative freedom to do whatever you want with in terms of lakes, this is the way to go. Our other solution was called the localized water sim actor, and that is for really small, no bigger than 10 meters, water bodies for like pools or ponds or really small lakes, maybe kind of thing. But essentially up until now, we had nothing in between these two. So yeah, this is where this bad boy comes in. And let's look at the settings. Now, you could place it pretty much anywhere you want, But when it comes to scale and rotation, you do need to use these parameters over here. So let's have a look at let me just grab this position coordinate for it, because the original actor was placed in a really nice spot, and maybe just drag it a little bit more towards center stage. Did that transfer correctly? Yeah. So let's just increase the scale to something really big, like 1,500, and this to 4,000. So we have something to work with. So now we can see that the area we've kind of that we're flooding at the moment, and let's just add a little bit of a twist so we could fill up this nice long valley that we had at the beginning. So a rotation around -50 is looking pretty good. This value is way too high for what it is at the moment. Maybe still a little too large. And yeah, we don't need to worry too much about it spilling way over there into the distance, but maybe we could fix this a bit more. Just sort of bring it in. And we're kind of going over into the next valley, and we don't want that, so let's just decrease this a little bit. But over here we could see that we're not maybe filling up this part, so let's just add a little bit more of a twist, and then maybe fine-tune this a little bit. So something like this is pretty good. For the sake of this tutorial, let's move on, because you could literally fiddle with these to no end in sight. So yeah, this is pretty much what the lake actors are. This is how they work. So let's have a look at the materials and how we can make it look better. So to start off, let's go into the lake materials, and what we're going to do is, whoops, let's just delete these two for the moment. And we're going to create a material instance of our material lake. Or actually, we do have a material instance here already, so let's just duplicate that. Control D, and we're going to call it tutorial water far. So we're going to drag this into our first slot for water surface material and our far water material. And instantly we can tell it's working, because everything started to look a lot worse. But yeah, let's fix that. So let's open up the new material instance that we created. And first of all, let's get rid of this overbearing white so we can actually see what's happening. Now, this is pretty much the same material that's being used for our WaterSim Infinite actor. So this is where all of these sort of horizon distance and these parameters comes in, because it's nice to have an extra bit of control where the water meets the sky at the horizon. But in this case, since we are using lakes that are surrounded by landscape and massive actors, we don't really need these. So we could sort of push it off a bit more into the side and maybe lower the blend a little bit so it's a smoother transition. And yeah, don't want to lose the effect quite that much at this point. So yeah, we're actually looking pretty good already. Now, everything else after this point pretty much boils down to your personal preferences in terms of artistic vision. This sort of color that we have at the moment could potentially work for this landscape, the sort of green algae filled lake, and with a bit of a brownish hint near the horizon if it's filled with sediment. But let's see what we could do to make it look a bit closer to the actor that we had at the beginning. So roughness, maybe set that to 0. It's still a little bit too low. And in terms of reflections from our landscape, it's looking good. But I'm not happy with the sort of response that we're getting from the sun. The sun should be a bit bigger, so maybe 0.1. This is looking much better already. And we still get to keep our crisp reflections. In terms of specularity, most materials in real life in general have a specularity of 0.5. And I'm not exactly sure what the value for water is, but it might be 0.5. One just tends to look better. This is a bit of a fight between accuracy and looking good, as most things in this video will be. One thing for sure though, metallic is supposed to be set to 0. We've kind of included this value in case you want to have some nice mirror reflections in some cases of the water. But yeah, accuracy dictates that this should be 0. And in terms of water parameters, we're pretty much done. Now let's look at the colors. Now colors are a very interesting topic because we're using the single layer volume material, which is kind of volumetric. It looks at how light is being scattered and how it's being absorbed. Now for the sake of ease, we've kind of renamed this shallow watercolor and deep watercolor. And a good way, let's just dive into the shallow water and see what it does. Now apart from your standard hue, color and whatnot that we can change here, shallow water, its value dictates how clear it is. And what that does, for example, is let's just go here and lower this value closer to black, so 0.01. And you can see that all of a sudden our water became a lot more clearer. We could see all the way deep into our lake. And let's see what happens when we increase this value to something high, like 0.1. Well, our lake now went haywire. Now we're getting a really sharp transition from our surface to our water. Now it's looking a bit too bright, almost toxic like. Let's see if we could do a bit something like that. Saturation also does have an effect on this, so play with these values very carefully. Now let's go back to our default. There's something funky about the colors not quite returning moment to what they were. So going back into our original look that we had, we're gonna set this to sort of like a bluish teal kind of color, maybe a bit more greenish. And we want to make it a little bit more transparent, so maybe drop this down to 15. This is quite good. Maybe increase the saturation a bit. And yeah, this is starting to look quite good. Next up, we have the deep watercolor. Now what this does, well, let's just set it to like a crazy value, like orange. And maybe increase this. Now the deep color strength is a multiplier. So right now we're dividing it essentially, making it a lot harsher. And oh look, now we have a sort of toxic spill kind of looking alien water. Now this may be a look that you're after. So yeah, more power to you. You can make some crazy combinations and some really funky, unique looking environments. But for the sake of this video, we're going to go with a bit more realistic. So another blue sort of thing. And yeah, this is looking pretty good. Now this works similarly to the shallow water. So the closer it is to black, the more clear it is. And for example, if we go this to 1, well, our water just became very muddy, if you will. And it also affected some of the color with the shallow water. So lowering this value is definitely something you'd want to do at the moment. Maybe not all the way to negative, but 0.1 is a good spot for it. Next up, we have water tint color. Now, this is also kind of affected by our horizon opacity. So if we set this to 10, we could see that our surface tint color now is showing up a lot more. So let's just give it a nice sort of a bluish hue. Now, when you're working with this particular value, it's important to note how water gets its coloring. Now, most of the time, unless there's something very specific about the water like algae, iron-specific minerals, or limestone, the main contributor to its color is our sky. If it's cloudy, our water will look grayish, sort of stormy-ish. In this case, it's nice, it's clear, and near the horizon, it's quite bright. So let's just go with a nice sort of bright color. So this is quite good. Now, remembering that we actually made our horizon opacity value quite extreme, let's lower this back a bit more. And now we could see that our water is starting to blend in quite well with our overall sky. It's starting to look a bit more realistic now. And finally, we have the light scatter direction, which is a little bit difficult to explain. So let me just show you what it does. Now, again, let's remember that the single layer water material is kind of volumetric. And this dictates how the sunlight in specific is scattered anisotropically filtered, I guess, across this volume in a way. So if we set that to something like 0.6, you could see that the sunlight hotspot is starting to move on the opposite side of the sun. Now, this is very unrealistic, but you know, it's something that you could mess with if you want. And if we start increasing the value, you could see that it's moving towards the sun to where its specular is. Realistically, this value should be 0.3 if you're into science and stuff. We do like to keep it around 0.5 just for the sake of making things a bit more interesting, but not too crazy. Whoops. Apologies. So let's just go back to 0. Maybe 7 or 5. Yeah. So this will kind of dictate how well your water responds to the sunlight. Next up, we have the subsurface mask, and that is our sort of little fake subsurface scattering that we have. Now, in order to use this, we do need to add in an additional actor. So let's go place actors and go with light direction blueprint. Now, whoops. Now, as soon as we drop into this little blueprint into our level, it's going to start talking to our water materials. It composes of just basically an arrow and a light source. The light source by default has intensity set to 0, so don't worry about it changing the look of your scene. If you increase it, you could use this as your light source instead of the main one and mess with its values here as well, just so it can be an atmospheric skylight. Right now, we just kind of have it as an extra blueprint just to tell us our direction. Why we have 2, it will become apparent in a minute. But let's start by cranking up this value like something really high so we could see what's going on. So to start us off, if we rotate this, we could see that this sort of fake subsurface scattering keeps following it. Of course, it's a bit too strong, but that's why we have the rest of the settings. Oops, everything just expanded. So light mask radius sort of controls this, well, hotspot that we have and how harsh it is. So this is a pretty good spot to where we want. You could copy and paste the rotation of your sunlight here and have it 100% accurate, but we're just not that concerned with this at the moment. Next, we have the verticality. Now, the verticality is adjust the verticality of this as a sort of a parameter. Now, the reason why you might have this is if you have a sort of day and night cycle and this is rigged to it, but you're not quite happy with the sort of accuracy of it, or maybe you just want to have a bit more artistic control with it, you could adjust this value further just so you have something that you're happy with. For example, well, the sunlight is there, but I want to have the subsurface scattering slightly offset. So this is the value for you. Near camera fade does what it says it does. It fades it near the camera, just so the effect is a bit more subtle. And then the color is pretty much obvious, the color. Now, how do we pick the color is slightly important, as in this case, we set our shallow water color to something a bit more bluish turquoise. And the idea is that, well, the scattering should also be kind of bluish. Now, in this case, it's yellow-green. So let's go with something a bit more accurate that we'd expect to see in real life. So this is pretty good, but our intensity is way too high. So let's set this to 110. We could set this to 1 and then mess with the verticality. Now, this isn't something that you'd have in all lighting scenarios. Like in this case right now, having this sort of a strong subsurface scatter is a bit unrealistic. So we're just going to mute the effect a bit down. But hey, for demonstration purposes, this is what you could do. And this is how it works. Next up, wave normals are pretty self-explanatory. You have the tiling of it. The sharpen kind of modifies this filter. It can just sharpen the waves a little bit extra, or if they look a bit too smooth. Then have the normal strength, so 0.5, 0.3, 0.8 is a good spot, but maybe 5. 6, yeah, 6 is looking a bit too strong, maybe 7. Yeah. Next up, you have speed, so we could increase this to be really strong, really fast. And we also have the normal texture. Waterline does come with a good selection of these, so if we hit the little folder with the magnifying glass, takes us to this folder where we could just drag and drop in different textures. And yeah, sometimes by default you might see this sort of flickering or ghosting rather with an animated material in Unreal Engine 5.0. And a good solution to that is either to set this C variable TSR dot shading projection flickering to 0, or setting the TSR period to something really low like 0.1, 0.5. But for the sake of this, let's just set this to 0, and boom, our water is nice and clear and sharp like before. So I quite like the original material for this, the normal and so on. So let's just revert to that, and maybe a bit slow down the normals to what they were before. Next up, we have a couple of simulation settings, and we're going to go over these in a separate video. We're going to do like a whole separate shallow water simulation and how objects interact with it. Next, we have horizon correction. Now, if you're using lake actors, it's very unlikely that you're going to need this. This is mostly useful for the infinite water sim, where normals that reach the horizon can look a bit weird. In this case, it doesn't really change anything since everything is surrounded by landscape, and it looks pretty good. It looks pretty accurate. Sim bleed fix. This is again something with water simulation. Refraction strength controls, well, the strength of the refraction, which is how light sort of is being broken up by the water. Now, we'll just do a quick demonstration. What this means is, for example, we have a cube and we place this underwater. It basically dictates how strongly the cube will wobble. For example, if we have this something like 0.5, you could see that it's very harshly distorted. And if we move far away, this effect can get quite strong, because ultimately it is a kind of a screen space effect, and it looks much more accurate the closer you are to the water. Now, we do have a setting called refractions distance blend that kind of offsets this, but for the sake of argument, a value of 9 or 0.1 is quite good. So let's just dive underwater, delete our cube, and continue. Next up, we have blueprint actors, and what these do are basically parameters that are being set by the lake blueprint itself. So changing these won't do anything. You can't even if you want to. And the global scaling parameters and these ones are also in the same boat. Finally, we have horizon controls, which we kind of went over in before. You have the horizon tint color, and currently we want to keep this kind of what our sky was, for accuracy's sake. It's looking quite pale towards the horizon, so let's just go with white. So yeah, overall, this is how the material setup for the lakes work. And something else that you could do is, once you're kind of happy with the lake that you have, you could explore a few more options in terms of depth and how it blends with the local environment, just to see if you could find any more interesting beaches or islands and so on and so forth. But yeah, the time has come to unhide the other lakes and see what we kind of have done. So scrolling up over here, you could see that we have a bunch of these actors. Some of these were quite quickly put together, and they do kind of clip off into the distance. But each of these comes with its own water material sets. So you could have different colors, different underwater colors, different undersurface materials for each one of these. And it's quite fun because once you have something that you like, you can just kind of copy it, paste it, and boom, all of a sudden you have another one lake actor. And in a scene like this, it's quite fun. You can just kind of start grabbing it and exploring different sort of valleys that you want to flood. For example, there's like a nice sort of riverbed over here that we could maybe use. Just lower it till it's looking good, adjust its size. So something like that. It's kind of conflicting, but we're not going to dive too deep into that. These are pretty much done the same way as the process that we've just outlined. For example, we could increase the strength of the deep one, make it a bit more milky. But just so you know that once you start editing one, unless they have their own unique one, surface material instance, you start editing the material instances for all other lakes that use this material. So let's just revert that. And oh, look, our original material doesn't look so great up far away. So this is clearly our horizon settings and we were too generous. So let's just increase the distance to something really high and just remove this effect altogether. And yeah, now our, whoops. Let's get rid of this. And yeah, now our lake looks good in all angles. Now let's talk a little bit about our post-process volume and our lumen settings. So we're using lumen reflections here, and our machine at the moment isn't strong enough to use lumen with hardware ray tracing, so this is the software ray tracing. And something we've noticed is that, let's get our lumen in here, is that the default settings can cause certain objects not to render at a distance. So the default of 20,000 basically stops this mountain from rendering. We can crank this value a lot higher. Unreal doesn't like that sometimes. But another thing is, despite that we're using lumen, we're still getting kind of screen space reflections effects. And basically what we found out is that if a mesh is past a certain size, it will not render in your lumen scene. For example, these massive sort of mountains do not appear in our lumen. We're not sure if this is a bug or if this is intentional, but yeah, it's something to just keep in mind. For example, if we go back to our original sort of area with this, we could see that these are much smaller meshes. These are the crater walls that we created using the other Quixel material. And yeah, lumen reflections is working just as intended with these. And if we go into our lumen scene, just the overview, yeah, they show up. But the really big meshes, the one that stretch, well, maybe kilometers, don't show up. We're not sure if this will happen if you're using hardware ray tracing. It's probably just something of the software side limitations, but it's something just to keep an eye on. If you're trying to create a scene, it might be best to just cut up this massive mountain range into maybe smaller mountain ranges. Don't go the full-on 10 kilometers in size, maybe break it down into 1 kilometer size each. We have larger walls here, and they also render as expected. So yeah, thank you for sticking around this long. These are the kind of cool little things we could do with lake actors if you go really overboard, start flooding bits and pieces of your landscape. If you're really tech savvy, you could probably rig this up with a sort of level sequencer and have parts of the map just get flooded in a really cool kind of way. And yeah, so I'm gonna stop wasting your time so you can go and make awesome things. Thank you for sticking around.